Hello, everyone. Welcome to Perspectives on a Way Forward, a roundtable discussion of the proposed plans for the future of the United Methodist Church. These plans will be before the delegates at the special call General Conference in St. Louis at the end of this month. I'm Vicki Brown, news editor for United Methodist News Service. I'll be moderating the conversation between the proponents of the proposed plan. During this discussion, we hope to present a reasoned conversation that will be informative for both delegates and the wider United Methodist audience. Here's the rundown of how this will unfold. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to present opening remarks. Afterward, we'll pose questions submitted by the panelists themselves, our audience through social media, and staff from News. When a question is directed to a speaker, he or she will have 2 minutes to answer. In order to address as many questions as possible, I'll step in if the speaker goes over the allotted time. Before we begin, I want to state that United Methodist News Service has no position on any of the proposals. As a journalistic organization, we provide fair, balanced, and objective coverage of the ongoing debate, and we are working tirelessly to provide avenues where all voices can be heard. This discussion is pre-recorded. It will be shared through social media and on umnews.org. Now, let's get started. I'm going to ask each of our 4 panelists to introduce themselves and offer opening remarks. Rob?
Great, thank you, Vicki. My name is Rob Renfroe. I am a pastor at the Woodlands United Methodist Church, just north of Houston, and also the president of Good News, a renewal movement within the United Methodist Church. I'd like to begin by saying thank you, Vicki, to you and to UMNS for putting this together. I think it's a real service for the church, so thank you. And also, I'd like to say that I believe that all of us on the panel are really people of goodwill. I've known Chris for a long while and think very highly of him. Mark and I had a great dinner together last night and got to hear his heart, and I appreciated that very much. And I don't know Althea, but what I've read about her leads me to believe that we all care deeply about the church. We all have a sincere commitment to Jesus Christ. We're all sharing what we hold passionately, and we're people that can do that in a very respectful way. So I'm very grateful for all of you that are on this panel. I really had hoped that we would be at a different place this close to General Conference 2019. I came out of Portland believing that our bishops and the church had heard that we wanted a new and creative way of resolving our differences. I thought that we understood that we needed not to come to General Conference with the same old plans to fight the same old battles. But unfortunately, that's not what has happened. And I'm afraid that we're going to come to General Conference, same plans, same players, winners, losers. And I had really hoped that we would have something that could bring us together, something that could affirm our deeply held beliefs, and then bless us as we all set out into the world to do what we thought God had called us to do. I'm afraid we've set ourselves up for a divisive and harmful General Conference. I'm praying that's not the case.
Chris?
My name is Chris Ritter. I'm a clergy member in the Illinois Great Rivers Annual Conference, and I pastor First United Methodist Church in Geneseo. I want to thank United Methodist News Service as well for hosting this forum. I'm here to speak on behalf of the Connectional Conference Plan, and it is the one plan that looks beyond the human sexuality divide and really looks at a United Methodism 2.0. It's by far the most ambitious plan. I brought a prop with me. These are all the parts of the Book of Discipline that would be relegated to connectional conferences. This is the Book of Discipline that we would have as a United Methodist Church. It's not really a compromise plan, it's a cooperation plan. And it invites us to be a church in a whole new way. And that takes courage, but I think it's the one plan that has the potential to leave us in actually a better place than what we are today. You know, it takes our old jurisdictional system, which is really a Jim Crow era map of the church. You can almost see the Mason-Dixon line if you look real close. It takes that and reinvents that whole level of the church to help us to restructure along ideological lines, I think the Connectional Conference Plan realizes that the human sexuality debate is just a shibboleth for deeper issues about how we approach Scripture and ministry. And I think it gives us 3 times the chance we have today of reaching the culture, because it allows 3 different expressions of the United Methodist Church. It requires agreement that doesn't exist right now. It requires constitutional amendments that will need to be passed and ratified. But it does set an optimistic tone for the future of the church. So I'm happy to be here and answer questions about the Connectional Conference Plan.
Thank you. Mark.
Thank you. My name is Mark Holland. I'm a clergy delegate from the Great Plains Conference of the United Methodist Church. I am 3rd generation United Methodist pastor, and as I tell everyone when I talk about this is personal to me, because this is our church, and I think it's personal to all of us, because we all have this deeply held passion for not only our faith in Jesus Christ, but also the tradition of the United Methodist Church. So I take that very seriously as we have these conversations with my brothers and sister who we have different views, but come out of the same tradition. I've been to 5 general conferences and have seen play out over the last 20 years a lot of the brokenness around the human sexuality debate specifically, but over a number of ideological issues. And I was at the conference in 2016 and was able to make the motion to ask the bishops to lead. It felt like the analogy where the dinner plate's just going to crash on the floor, and the only thing you can do is sweep it up and throw it away. And it felt like that's where we were headed in 2016, and I asked the General Conference they'd be willing to support asking the bishops to lead. I give the bishops a lot of credit because they didn't have to lead. They could have said this is a legislative issue and this is in your court, but they had a lot of courage to take this issue up, and I give the bishops a lot of credit for being willing to step into the most difficult division we've had in our church, probably since before the Civil War in the United States. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for the work of the Commission on the Way Forward. Really was representative of all of us. There were some, and you know, we use terms left and right and conservative and liberal. None of those terms fit any of us perfectly. We use them as placeholders, but there were very conservative people on the Commission. There were very liberal people on the Commission, and a lot of folks in the middle who worked very hard to come up with a plan. And I think it is the One Church plan, supported by nearly 2/3 of our bishops and approved unanimously by our Judicial Council as constitutional. And so I think it's the right step for our church, and I'm excited to talk about it today.
We have one panelist whose flight was canceled due to weather, so I'm turning to her on Skype. Reverend Miller.
Thank you. I am Althea Spencer Miller, and very grateful to be here and thankful to God that we're having a forum like this, and to the United Methodist News Service. I start from the conviction as a gay person that being gay is not incompatible with Christ. And I stand in solidarity here and supported by the Queer Clergy Caucus and an extensive fellowship and gathering collective of LGBTQI persons who are in the Methodist Church. And as I think with these persons in my heart and mind, and present to my brothers and to you, my sister Vicky, I'm aware that solving a problem that is not initially about the church's structure, by addressing church structure, actually avoids the problem. And I think that remembering what our values are, some of our values that have been left behind, is important. And so I represent the simple plan, which is very simple. It's not addressing structure. It simply removes all identity-based, discriminatory, and punitive language from the Book of Discipline, favoring grace and religious freedom over institutional law, and in our best understanding, following John Wesley's example. We're just removing language that was inserted about 47 years ago and which initiated the crisis that we now face. As LGBTQ persons insist, we are children of God.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have several questions to put before our guest. Once they've addressed our pre-submitted questions, our panelists will have an opportunity to ask each other questions and to make a brief closing statement. So I'm going to start with you, Mark. And this question is for all 4 panelists. So what is the most important point for people to understand about your plan, the One Church?
The most important point to understand about the One Church plan is, I don't like to use the word compromise because that has such a negative connotation in our community. We're compromising our values, we're compromising our theology. I really look at it as a balanced plan that doesn't try to fix anybody. It doesn't try to change the ethos of who we are. Our church is a very large, eclectic, big tent church. We have a great diversity of practice and belief across. You go from California to Alabama to across the world. We have a very diverse church. And the One Church plan says we are willing to love and support one another to reach the mission field that's significant to you. There are many communities in our country that the LGBTQ community is an important part of the mission field and want to reach that community fully. There are other parts of the world and parts of our country where folks don't feel like that is an outreach that they want to do or that they're not willing to affirm. The One Church plan isn't a judging plan. It doesn't say that this group's right and this group's wrong. There are good Christian people who deeply hold their beliefs. And to allow different expressions of our faith to say, you reach your mission field with integrity, and we'll allow another mission field to reach theirs. I think that the lack of control that's in the One Church plan that really protects the conscience of every local church, every pastor, every conference, every bishop, and allows them to be who they are is really critical. And I think that's distinct about the One Church plan, and I think it's its greatest strength. I think the diversity of our church is our great strength, and dividing our church up into theological camps, I think diminishes all of us. So my hope is that folks will support the One Church plan because it has the best opportunity to hold the fullness of Christ's church together in the United Methodist Church.
I'm going to turn to Althea next for the simple plan.
Thank you. The critical point about the simple plan is that it helps the church to get, as an institution, to get to a point where it is no longer sanctioning any form of discrimination. It participates in the altering of that history. We know what the racial history of the church has been. We overcame that. Some of the same language applied. We knew what the gender discrimination was like in the church, especially around ordination. We overcame that. The simple plan allows that the church, by removing the punitive language and the identity-based language, no longer sanctions any form of discrimination, certainly not this one. It will not alter the structure of the church, and in that way I think we stand with the One Church plan. We're similar to the One Church plan. We do not impose, the simple plan does not impose any compulsion on any group of persons inside the church, and it allows for LGBTQI persons to be present in the church in any region, in any jurisdiction, in any conference, without a sense of an axe hanging over their heads, without that sense of vulnerability that at any point someone is going to be able to enact some kind of charge against them. I think it frees the entire church to be who they are, where they are. It doesn't change. We would love to see a new horizon where there is just no sanctioning at all of prejudice or discrimination where it exists. But for the time being, it allows persons the freedom of their conscience. And I think that is grace-filled, and it is the way of God in Christ Jesus.
Thank you. Chris, would you like to speak to the Connectional?
Sure. The U.S. Military chaplains have to cooperate with one another across great differences, and they have a phrase called cooperation without compromise, and that's been something that I've been working on the last 5 years. How can we get to a place where we can work together? I hear a lot of folks that support maybe the simple plan or the one church plan say that this satisfies the conscience of traditionalists. It does not, and I've become convinced, as I've talked to people across the church, that if either of those plans pass, we're going to end up with more than one church. And so the Connectional Conference Plan tries to create a wineskin that will accommodate everyone. There's a lot of ideas that we think, I've heard a lot of people across the spectrum say is a good idea. I've heard people say, I wish we didn't have General Conference on U.S. election years. Well, the Connectional Conference Plan does that. I've heard people say, I wish we didn't get together for 2 weeks at General Conference and it wasn't, a lot of what we talk about isn't relevant to a lot of folks that are there because it's finding pensions they don't have access to and that sort of thing. We have a much shorter General Conference under the Connectional Conference Plan, a much thinner book of discipline under the Connectional Conference Plan. A lot of the things our general agencies need to be reinvented. The Connectional Conference Plan triggers that. So there's a lot of work that we need to do anyway over the next 10 years. It's not like we can pass one of these plans and then we'll be fine. My bishop got up and said at our meeting of the clergy last week, he said, we're circling the drain. I never heard a bishop say that before. What we're doing is not working. This issue could go away tomorrow, and we need to have major work done in the United Methodist Church. And so why not lean into that? Why not restructure completely and have the UMC 2.0 that's really going to take us into the future without division?
Okay, thank you. Rob, you're speaking to both the traditional and the modified traditional.
Right, thank you very much. Well, what I appreciate about the traditional, modified traditional plan is that it keeps us connected, maybe in a different way than our other panelists would see. But I think it keeps us connected to the clear teaching of Scripture, keeps us connected to 2,000 years of Christian teaching regarding sexual ethics. It keeps us connected to our brothers and sisters in the developing world, many of whom have told us that should we adopt one of these other plans, they would be forced to leave the United Methodist Church. And it keeps us connected to the global ecumenical church. I don't want to separate the United Methodist Church from any of those important connections. I don't want to separate ourselves from the global ecumenical church. And I believe that if we change our sexual ethics, that's exactly what will happen. I think, too, that it connects us with our historic way of dealing with difficult problems. When we decided, as we, before any of us were born, or 1 year after I was born, when we decided to ordain women, there were people who didn't want to do that. There was an annual conference, I believe, that appealed that decision and said we'd like to have our own ordination standards. What we didn't do was suggest that some annual conferences could ordain women and others not, and call it the one church plan. In the same way, if we had pastors who said that they did not agree with infant baptism, we wouldn't say, well, we honor your conscience, you just have a very sincere different view than we do. We'll have pastors with different practices within the denomination. Both with baptism of infants and then of ordination with women, we said, look, we Methodists, we have a position. We think it's biblical, we think it's what God desires. And this is not a matter of individual conscience. This is church polity. This is who we've agreed that we're going to be. And so I think the modified traditional plan keeps us connected to the way that we've dealt with other difficult issues. With those issues, we don't paper over them, have different policies and practices, and call ourselves one church. We say we have a Methodist way. And if you're comfortable with it, wonderful. If not, you're probably a very fine person. You may be called to be in ministry, but it's probably outside of the United Methodist Church.
Chris, what role should the Bible play in decision-making at General Conference? And if there are multiple biblical interpretations, who decides the right one?
Well, that's a great question. Our current teachings on human sexuality reflect our United Methodist understanding of human sexuality as related to Scripture. And I believe when you look at our global church, a majority of our church supports that. But it seems like we have two canons within the canon that we read from. We have, I think we even have 2 John Wesleys when we talk about the Wesleyan tradition and what it means. And these are mutually refutable. I mean, to some of the claims that one side makes refute the claims the other side makes. So there's no way to harmonize those. So that's what brings us to a structural solution like the Connectional Conference Plan. Since we're reading Scripture in different ways, since those ways directly contradict one another, how can we be one church? And the Connectional Conference Plan says we can do that by being 3 churches within the same church. It's not an ideal plan. It's, you know, the Connectional Conference Plan isn't anybody's first choice. It's not my first choice. If you look at the Commission on a Way Forward, nobody that endorsed the Connectional Conference Plan endorsed it alone. I think maybe there was one that did that, but it had equal support from the One Church Plan supporters, equal support from the traditional plan supporters. It doesn't reflect anybody's ideology. It just simply says we're never going to agree on this stuff. So why don't we organize our church so that we're not harming one another, so that we're not fussing with one another, fighting with one another, and let's get on with the kingdom business as we understand it.
Rob, would you like to answer next?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, hopefully the Bible informs not just what we do at General Conference, but informs every decision that we make. I think we probably agree on that. Who should determine what we believe? Well, the truth is we believe in the priesthood of all believers, so all of us determine what we believe for ourselves. But when it comes to being a church, I don't think we would describe it quite this way, but General Conference determines where we come down. General Conference takes what the delegates believe the Bible teaches, and then they try to find a way to put it into the life of the church, and in some ways legislatively. So who decides what the Bible teaches on these issues is General Conference. We might have our different viewpoints, but I think if we're going to be one church, we need to agree to live by what General Conference states is the will of the United Methodist Church.
Althea?
The role of the Bible is normative for all of us. That's the value of the Bible is not at issue. How we read the Bible is at issue, and we come at it and we end up in very different places. We do that as individuals over the course of a lifetime. We do that as an institution in our collective groups. The Bible is not a homogeneous book. It has multiple voices, and those voices lend themselves to different people in different ways. To even think about it as a univocal text already truncates what the Bible is, and I actually think denies the capacity of God to deal with diversity in a marvelous and wonderful and at times conflicted way. We value the Bible to ask about its role. Perhaps its role is not paradigm setting when it comes to the conference. Perhaps it is template setting to recognize that an institution is connected to a book that is fundamentally diverse in its literature and its theologies and its ways of addressing multiple issues. That is a template. And to have a structure that presumes homogeneity built upon a book that is not homogeneous seems to be theologically problematic and something that we need to talk about more seriously. And LGBTQ persons are not geographically confined. Neither do we even read the text in the same way, all of us. Diversity is the word as template.
Okay, thank you. Mark?
Well, the Bible is the foundation of our faith and points us to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and is the grounding piece of who we are, not only as United Methodists, but as Christians around the world. And the United Methodist Church has a value of looking at the primacy of Scripture and looking at tradition, reason, and experience in interpreting the Scripture. The Bible's never changed, and no one's arguing for changing the Bible. The words of the Bible are the same. But the interpretation of the Bible has changed over time in a number of issues. We look at the issue of slavery. We split the church north and south because there's a whole group of people where they wanted bishops to be able to hold slaves. Well, we think about that today, and that's an outrageous interpretation of the Scriptures, but use the Scriptures to justify slavery for 2,000 years. And actually, when we stopped endorsing slavery in this country, it changed 2,000 years, longer than that really. The whole human history has slavery within it. And the Bible mentions slavery 353 times. But we know now that our interpretation is that all people are equal. And the idea that some are born slaves and some are born free is an outrageous idea that Christians cannot support. The words of the Bible are still in there, but the interpretation of the Bible has changed. The same is true with women in ministry. 2,000 years of Christian tradition, in most traditions, women are not ordained. And in fact, it's still the minority of Christian churches today that ordain women. The Bible still says a woman shall remain silent in the church, and says a woman shall have no authority over a man. Those words are still in the Bible. We just have a broader understanding through our tradition, reason, and experience to interpret those. The challenge we have right now is there's a lot of great Christians who believe that the words about homosexuality are descriptive for another time and no longer prescriptive for us. And there are folks in our church who believe it is still prescriptive for us on homosexuality. The folks with the One Church plan do not believe that this is the defining factor in our church that should divide. We have different interpretations from faithful Christians, and we need to honor both of those, and the One Church plan does that.
I'm going to stay with you for the next question. Should each proposal include an exit plan allowing local churches to leave amicably with a reasonable percentage of property and assets?
Well, the key word you used is reasonable, and therein the debate begins, right? There is already an exit plan, if you will, in the Book of Discipline for churches that want to leave that is being actively used. I mean, there are churches that have been leaving our denomination probably since its beginning, which is why those provisions are in the Book of Discipline. I think there are some concerns from everyone about whether or not they're being consistently interpreted within the conferences. But there are provisions already in there. My view on exit plans is I think we need gracious staying, not gracious exits. I think we need to look at the One Church plan. The greatest gift it does for our church is it takes these divisions and it drops grace in the middle of it and says we can be graceful to one another. And it's not saying if you don't agree with this, then you need to leave the church. It says if you don't agree with this, you can practice differently in your mission setting. That's great grace for everyone. So the only people that have to leave on the One Church plan are people that want to leave. As opposed to the traditional plan, the people that have to leave are folks who are not falling in line with a particular worldview. So I think the grace of it doesn't necessitate an exit plan. I also think we have a 4-day general conference, and the chances of us crafting a exit plan that's fair and adequate in the short time that we have is unlikely. I would recommend that we postpone that to 2020, that we come to this church, come to this conference with a heart to unite the church, and then after we decide what we decide in St. Louis, then we have time for people to reflect on that. Taking a year before we decide that lowers the temperatures. I think there's a lot of calamity stated of what's going to happen if the One Church plan passes. I think that's overstated. And I think if people have time to take a deep breath and realize the One Church plan codifies who we already are, and we can live with one another. So I don't support an exit plan at this general conference. And I think the groups that want to leave need to come to the general conference with a proposal and ask to leave, rather than putting one group's desire to leave baked into our Book of Discipline for all time.
Okay. Chris, would you like to?
You know, I hear that comment a lot. There's already an exit plan. Well, the exit plan for clergy is surrender your credentials and leave, and that's not a very good exit plan. There's the exit plan for the current exit plan for churches is request to a church conference. The bishop and the cabinet will come in and see if there's enough denominational loyalists to see if we can keep the building open with the 40% rather than the 60% that want to leave. If a denomination's better together, surely a congregation's better together. Surely congregations should have the dignity of finding a future together and moving into it. If it's good for a denomination, it's got to be good for a local church as well. So I think there is a need for an exit path. We're a connectional church. And when you have the vision of the church that the One Church plan kind of puts forth, our supervisory structures can become weaponized against one another. And how clergy are appointed. It's one way to say you can maintain the New Testament sexual ethic that the church has believed for 2,000 years, but your district superintendent or your bishop may be positioned otherwise. It just doesn't create a space for traditionalists. So there has been a group across ideological lines that are calling for a gracious exit, and I support that. I think the need for it is greatly reduced under the Connectional Conference plan. If the simple plan of the One Church plan passes, we definitely will need a gracious exit to keep us all out of the lawsuits and things we've seen. Every other mainline Christian denomination has gone through this, and it's not gone well in any example. And I think we can learn from their mistakes, or we can repeat their mistakes. And I hope that we learn from them.
Okay. Rob?
Yes, of course. So I think the other panelists will probably disagree with the analogy that I'm going to use, but I have thought that it would be like my telling my wife, I'm going to change our covenant. And I'm going to make some changes, and what I've changed, I'm going to engage in some things that you think are wrong. But you don't have to do those things. So I don't see why you should want to leave. And if she said, well, I am going to leave, then what the One Church plan would say is, well, you're not taking anything with you. You don't get the house, you don't get the car, you don't get the kids. I'm going to take everything from you. Wait a year, calm down, and then see if you really still want your stuff or not. We say we have deeply held convictions on all sides. And there's some people that are so tired of this, they want out. I want to honor the fact that people have been damaged and people have been hurt, that people have deeply held positions. It's a matter of conscience. And to think that our brothers and sisters in Christ believe that somehow it's best to tell others you can't leave with anything, or you can negotiate with a bishop who may see things very differently than you do. There's no guarantee that you will get a fair treatment, or if that bishop will allow you to take your property under any conditions. That's what we've seen in other denominations. Most of them don't have bishops, but some bodies work well with individual churches. Some are punitive, and some absolutely do not allow churches to leave with property. So we need something that standardizes that and is that fair for whoever wants to leave, whatever viewpoint.
Althea, on an exit plan?
Yes, I take the point that if a group needs to leave, we should work towards a reasonable way of working out the finances, but I don't wish to be objective about this question, because already for financial reasons, programs that benefit LGBTQ persons as part of the mission of the church have already lost funding. Harm has been done. If someone, to use the analogy, if someone decides to leave their wife or their husband, it means that they no longer love that person. They no longer seek that person's goodwill. They no longer wish to be partners with that person. And what I hear as a gay person is that I am so despicable that persons can speak about my devotion, my love of Christ, and when I say my, I'm thinking collectively of all of us LGBTQI persons, can recognize the value of our commitment, can recognize that there is grace in us, that God works through us, that we are called, and still look at us and say, you are not good enough for our companionship, for our fellowship. Give us our money so that we can get as far away from you as possible. That is living harm. And as to the structural division that seems to hold us all together, it does not hold LGBTQI persons together, because if we divide for structural reasons, there will be LGBTQI persons in those divisions. This issue will not go away, because we will not go away. I am not for division.
Okay. All right, now we're going to enter the portion of our program where questions will be addressed to specific panelists. So, Althea, often progressives say that we need to change our polity on sexuality to reach modern progressive people, especially young people. Now, church attendance is falling across denominations. If the United Methodist Church becomes more progressive, what would happen to attendance?
If I could do some vocabulary shifting, that issue is something I have been exposed to in the context of the quest for the full inclusion of LGBTQI persons inside the United Methodist Church. Not all of us are progressives on every issue. We're a conglomerate of approaches to all the issues that we speak about. So it's not only a progressive concern. I'd also like to move away from a strict accounting of the numbers that are in the church on a Sunday for worship to a fuller way of thinking about who passes through our doors. I attend the Church of the Village in West Village in New York, and we get a lot of folk who just enter the church in a McDonald's kind of way, and I don't mean that derogatorily. They're passing by, they see a church that is inclusive, they stop in, they visit with us. Some persons continue to fellowship with us. Some people have a good time for one Sunday, some visit from other places. So a way of counting that includes not only the steady presence, but also the nomadic presence inside the church. But I think the biggest impact will be upon the people who feel that the Methodist Church has something to offer them in terms of ministry. The people who will turn to pastors, turn to our church members. Those are numbers that we don't easily account for, and they swell the figure. It will affect positively the mission of the United Methodist Church to be more fully open, more fully inclusive, more fully welcoming. The gospel of Jesus Christ, with all its ramifications, will be more readily available to a wider group of persons.
Thank you. Rob, what message should LGBTQ United Methodist hear from the traditional or the modified plans?
I hope what they hear is that those of us who support this plan are every bit as committed to the first part of our statement about sexual ethics as we are to the rest of it, which is that all persons are persons of sacred worth and all persons are welcome in our churches. I often, when I speak about this, I begin by saying that if you cannot love LGBTQ persons, you don't really need to be engaged in this conversation. Our primary call as followers of Jesus Christ is to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbor, and that applies to all people. I hope that they would hear that we believe that the truest truth about them as it is about us is that we all are made in the image of God, we all have sacred worth, and that everyone is welcome in our churches. All of us are broken, all of us struggle, all of us are sinful, and we all need a community of faith to go on a journey with that will lead us towards, hopefully, transformation and some bit of holiness in our lives. So I hope that they would hear that though we cannot affirm all sexual practices, what we can do is accept all people, that we want to be a church for all people. And many LGBTQ persons, they discover that, in fact, they are welcome in our churches.
Okay. you. Mark, the One Church plan is presented as a compromise. Centrist and liberals get a new definition of marriage and the right to marry and ordain practicing gay people. What do evangelicals get with the One Church plan that they don't already have?
Well, that's a great question. And I think, again, the word compromise triggers a lot of conversation about things. I think it's about balance. That from a progressive side, it is true that it does remove the prohibitions for ordination, and it removes this harmful language of incompatible with Christian teaching. And it also allows the default in the One Church plan, and this is very important, is that there can be no gay marriages or same-sex marriages in our churches unless the church votes. So the default plan is that that doesn't happen, which for 90% of our churches, there just aren't a lot of gay and lesbian people asking to get married there, and those churches are not going to have to talk about it. That's one of the talking points of other groups that are working against it, is that every church would have to vote. Only churches that feel like reaching gay and lesbian people are part of their mission field would need to vote, and then they could allow weddings in their churches. So it does open it up. What it gives for evangelicals or for conservatives or however individuals want to define themselves, it's not for me to define, is that it gives them an opportunity to be in the church and continue to practice the way they're currently practicing. Every local church continues to be, can choose to have conservative practice. Pastors are protected intrinsically in the One Church plan to continue to be conservative. Every bishop, every annual conference is allowed to continue their practice. And that's really the biggest difference with the One Church plan, is it doesn't strive to control folks who disagree. It doesn't say that every church has, right now our Book of Discipline and the traditional modified plan are significantly worse in my mind, because they seek to, every church has to practice like an evangelical church, which just doesn't fit our mission fields. No one's saying to conservative churches, you have to stop being conservative. It does say, because we're not going to vote at General Conference about what we believe about homosexuality. What we're going to vote on at General Conference is, are we willing to live in a church with people who think very differently than we do? And the answer for the One Church plan is yes, and we're a better church for it.
Chris, what happens if the Connectional Conference plan gets adopted by General Conference, but the annual conferences don't ratify it? Are you concerned that that might create more turmoil and chaos in the church?
Well, there is the hurdle of the supermajority passage and the ratification votes. There's a timeline for the Connectional Conference plan. We'll know the answer to that question by April of next year. And guess what? We have General Conference 2020 you know, we could do the Connectional Conference plan at this annual conference, see if the church will buy into this vision, and if they don't, we have the One Church plan and the traditional plan that can duke it out at General Conference 2020. That's one way to go. I think there's not a lot of traction right now for the Connectional Conference plan, because it's no one's first choice. We wish we were in a different situation. If someone from the traditional side speaks up for the Connectional Conference plan, then the folks on the progressive side say, aha, there's weakness for the traditional plan. And if somebody for the on the progressive side, we're tempted to say, oh, the One Church plan's in trouble, that's why. And so we're really in a place where I think there's more support for a new reworking of the issue than what we really currently see. I hope that's the case. But we do have another General Conference coming up in 2020, and that's another opportunity for us. And that the other alternative would be General Conference 2020 could undo whatever we do in 2019. So there's uncertainty in any of these plans, because if they could be passed by a simple majority, they can be unpassed by a simple majority with the next General Conference. So I don't think uncertainty is unique to the Connectional Conference plan.
Okay. Althea, the simple plan doesn't only remove the restrictions against partnered gay persons serving in ordained ministry, it places no restrictions on a pastor's sexual life. Was that intentional, and if so, why?
I have to admit, I am not sure I fully understand that question, in the sense, the aspect of it about placing restrictions on a pastor's sexual life. I'm not clear what is intended by that.
Well, my understanding is that the simple plan removing the language about sexuality, so there would be no restrictions on a pastor, gay or straight, having sex outside of marriage or any of the other things that we would normally consider something we wouldn't want our clergy to be doing.
Well, I'll just lift up two of our amendments that I have in front of me. Our amendment to paragraph 161C retains the language, "We affirm the sanctity of the marriage covenant that is expressed in love, mutual support, personal commitment, and shared fidelity." We're not touching that. We also retain, "We affirm that sexuality is God's good gift to all persons. We call everyone, not just clergy, everyone, to responsible stewardship of this sacred gift." So we're not introducing anything more than what is already there, which is actually sufficient in setting a standard of behavior for all persons within the United Methodist Church, and assuredly then clergy should be able to live up to this standard. What I would want to emphasize in this is that queer persons are very capable of love and of long-standing permanent monogamous relationships. If the church does not permit us to have those relationships, then to even have a discussion about whether we honor marriage or not is toxic, difficult, and punitive in a sense, because we're tied into a place where we cannot show that. Yet despite being so tied, we consistently demonstrate, those of us who are so inclined to be married, to have permanent long-term relationships, we demonstrate repeatedly that we can honor those commitments. We do so by example and by upholding what is already in the Book of Discipline. So yes, sexual responsibility is important to us.
All right, thank you. Rob, the traditional and modified traditional plan seems to emphasize consequences and penalties as part of strengthening the accountability of the church. Do the concepts of just resolution and healing, as set forth in the Book of Discipline, paragraph 362, also receive emphasis, and if so, how?
That's a very good question. And you're getting to something that has been really a great frustration for those of us who are traditionalists, because the just resolution process has been misused over and over again. What is very typical is for a pastor to break our covenant, and perhaps by a marrying gay couple. Someone files a complaint. It's never done lightly. People I know that have done that, it's always with great trepidation and prayer, reticent to do it. And then the bishop and the team get it, and they begin to deal with it. And what we've seen over and over again is that when a progressive bishop is in charge, that the discipline for the offense is as little as a 24-hour suspension. Sometimes it's been writing a paper on why you did this and why you felt like you were right and how we should all live together with differences. And some bishops have just dismissed the complaint altogether and not even given a reason why. The way that I understand how the Bible would want a true process of resolution, restoration, reconciliation is the one who broke the covenant should acknowledge what he or she did, take ownership of that, ask for forgiveness. We would use the word confess what we have done, and then grace can be given and that person can be restored back into the life of the church, and the unity of the church can be restored. So the addition that we have added would be that the person who makes the complaint also gets to be part of the just resolution process, to say, yes, I think this was done properly, rather than passing it off to people who share the same ideology and who have proven themselves unwilling to really make that a just resolution.
Okay. Mark, would the one church plan be final for the church, or would it be, as some have said, a first step towards full inclusion?
Naturally, I'd like to tell everyone that the one church plan will solve all of our problems, and everyone's going to join hands and sing Kumbaya at the end of General Conference 2019, right? That's probably not going to happen. The one church plan, none of these plans are final steps. None of these plans, I mean, the church is going to continue to grow and evolve through the ages. And so the solutions that we have for 2019 are not necessarily the solutions that we are going to have in 2030. And I think that's true for any of the plans. So the one church plan is not a panacea. It's not going to fix all the challenges of our church. Our church has tremendous challenges reaching our mission fields regardless of our views and beliefs. I mean, we have a very challenging environment, particularly in the Western world, in reaching folks, and we need to continue to push forward. So does the one church plan, is it a step forward? I mean, this is one of the concerns that people have. If it's a first step to justice, what's the next step? And the answer is, we don't know. I mean, we really don't know. What we do know is that what the one church plan, what we do agree on now is we're not of one mind. We agree on that. We are not of one mind on this issue. And now we need to decide, is it important that we control the other side? Is it important that one group impose their view on another group? We know in the United States, because we're talking to all the same delegates, we know in the United States, one church plan is overwhelmingly supported, and the traditional plan has very little support, and we're still looking for support for the Connectional Conference plan. But the overwhelming support right now is for the one church plan, because it says everyone gets to be who they are, and we're not going to impose a worldview on churches, pastors, conferences, and bishops that doesn't fit them. We already have that diversity in our church, and we just need to insert grace into it instead of punishment and instead of evictions. We need to insert grace into it to allow us to be who we are. And so I think the one church plan is the right plan for right now in our church, without question.
Okay. Chris, how long would it take for the Connectional Conference plan to take effect? And are you concerned that some people would decide that it's taking too long and leave anyway?
The Connectional Conference plan has been called a very complex plan, and the reason that's true is because we're a very complex church, and it's going to take a while to sort us all out. Eventually, we're going to come to a thin book of discipline, a shorter general conference. I think it's the eventually simple plan, but there is quite a process to get us there. You know, the connectional conferences, there's 3 in the United States. One would basically be the simple plan, one would be the one church plan, and one would be the traditional plan. They would form in 2022, so ratification would happen by 2020. The connectional conferences would form in 2022, and then General Conference 2024, we moved to 2025, and all this part of the Book of Discipline would be adapted by those connectional conferences. So there is an extended timeline, but guess what? If the one church plan passes, you're going to have, without an exit plan, you're going to have years of lawsuit and jurisdictions needing to adjust their annual conference maps and an exodus. No matter what happens, there's going to be adjustments. So we can either lean into it or we can sort of let it happen to us. I think the Connectional Conference plan at least gives us a roadmap for the future. It's a long roadmap, but it's going to be long anyway. I think we're fooling ourselves to think that we can have a vote this month and the issue will be behind us. We've got bigger issues to face.
Okay. I have a couple of questions for all the panelists, and then we'll move to the part where the panelists will ask questions of each other. So, Rob, I'm going to start with you. Okay. Who suffers if your plan passes?
One thing that I don't like about going to General Conference is that we know that people are hurt. We know that people feel damaged. And that's why I had hoped that we might be given an option for this General Conference that would change the game, that we wouldn't have the same people promoting the same plans. All these plans have been out there, okay, to varying degrees. Chris is really kind of the newest and the most creative, but even it was around before 2016. The One Church plan in various forms has been around for many years. And I was so hopeful that the people that we entrusted to lead us to a new place would do something that was creative, that was healing, that allowed us each to be true to our convictions and not have to come and fight anymore. So yeah, people are going to be hurt at this general conference, and it didn't have to be this way. We could have done much better. We could have worked together to create something that honored our differences and our deeply held beliefs. But instead, what we have been set up for is what I believe will be the most harmful, most damaging general conference that we have ever seen. I know that my views hurt people. I go away from general conference, and technically my side, we don't like using the word, has won every time since 1972. I never go away feeling like a winner. I go away depressed and sad for my church and sad that good people have been hurt. I can't walk away from my beliefs. I can't expect these folks to walk away from their beliefs, even though if they were ever codified in the Book of Discipline, it would do great harm to my church and to many churches like mine. So we have really good people who see this really differently, and because we were not given a different kind of option, people are going to be hurt.
Okay. Althea, would you like to speak to this? Who would suffer if your plan passed?
I found it a very difficult question to think about. If the simple plan passed, and that would be wonderful. If it passed, I think the people who would suffer, and I hesitate to use that word suffer, I think the people who would be hurt, who would be angry, are the persons who do not wish to see LGBTQI full inclusion in the church. I can't call it suffering because they would still go away being able to live their lives fully. The only impact upon them is that they would be invited to be part of a body of people that grows in grace, grows in love, grows in its capacity to interact with persons who are different, and to find themselves growing out of a boxed God into a God who has created this wonderful diversity of humanity, and I do believe has generated a kingdom that we all can live in. So I hesitate to use the word suffering. I do think there would be hurt and anguish for persons who have deeply held beliefs around LGBTQI persons. But if the simple plan does not pass, there will be vocational, life value, self-esteem, diminishing suffering for the LGBTQI community, because there will remain institutionalized validation of the rights of different groups to keep discriminating against LGBTQI persons. Okay. That's suffering.
Mark?
Well, I think the issue of suffering is an interesting question, because I think there is suffering now. And just by comparison, the traditional plan is by far the most punitive. I mean, it's a 22-page plan. 7 pages are penalties, including mandatory sentencing guidelines, and then 6 pages of leaving. So it's a winners and losers group, and it basically says, this is the worldview, and we're going to impose it on this other group. And if you don't like that, you're going to be forcibly removed from the church through trials. There's going to be a certification process where everyone has to sign. And you have to certify, the way the traditional plan is written is you have to certify your view on homosexuality, not on your faith in Jesus Christ as the living God. But it raises homosexuality above all other issues in our church. And we basically organize our church around homosexuality, and we punish people who don't believe that. Not only LGBTQ persons, but their allies as well. So it's a winners and losers plan. The one church plan, who would suffer? Every local church gets to choose whether or not it's going to do marriage. And every pastor gets to choose whether or not they're going to do marriage. Everyone's conscience is protected. There's no forced suffering. There's no forced worldview on either group. Every annual conference will decide if they're going to ordain gay and lesbian people. And here's the reality. There are gay and lesbian people in every annual conference around the world doing effective ministry right now. So the annual conference would be able to decide, and every bishop would not be forced to go against their conscience. So in terms of the suffering, if someone is suffering by another church being who they are, I think that's their choice. But in terms of the church saying, we're going to punish, and if we reverse this and said, we're going to have a reverse, if the simple plan, we're not just removing the language, but it said everyone must do this, or you're going to be brought up on trial, that would be punitive. The one church plan is not punitive. It gives grace for people to be who they are. And if people choose to suffer because people are being who they are, I think that's people's individual choice that we can't control.
Yeah.
Chris?
Well, we're in a difficult place. And, really, we've been talking about LGBTQI folks. This is only about the LG part of that. That's we haven't even got to the other part, really, to talk about the future. Your question was who would suffer under the Connectional Conference plan. It's the one plan that I think has the potential to have everyone find a place that works for them. Each Connectional Conference has its own logo, has its own name, has its own bishops, yet we remain the United Methodist Church with connection to one another. I think one of the losers in the Connectional Conference plan would be the outside influencers. Some people don't realize there's thousands of dollars that flow in, and it's not a few thousand, it's many, many thousand, trying to influence. The United Methodist Church has become a prize in the culture war. If we become the largest church that changes our definition of marriage, that's going to be a win for some folks. If we keep a traditional stance, it's going to be a win for others. I would like to think the Connectional Conference plan is not a win-lose scenario, and that it's the church saying we're not going to play this game anymore. We quit that whole thing, and we're going to organize ourselves differently, maintaining the connection we can maintain with one another, and we're not going to fight over the same things over and over again. It's amazing the amount of energy that's been expended on this effort. The meetings just I've been to, flown to, been a part of, it's amazing internal energy that should be put toward the mission field. We're all staring at our belly buttons. We're coming to put more ink in a book when no one's listening to the ink that's already in the book. So why are we doing this to one another? Let's stop the harm. Let's stop the fighting. Let's find a different way to be the church.
Okay. Mark, how can we talk with one another in a spirit of Christian love, and what does that look like?
Well, it's a really good question. It's not with 864 people with 8 microphones and a countdown timer with 3 speeches for and 3 speeches against. Unless we move to shorten it because we're running out of time, then it's 2 for and 2 against, and it's 1 minute each. The legislative process is not the way we're going to resolve problems. The way we're going to address our differences is having dinner together, right? The way we're going to resolve our differences is putting people in a room and actually talking through the issues rather than a legislative process. Our church was modeled after the U.S. government with 3 branches of government, and 250 years ago that seemed like a really good idea. Unfortunately, we're behaving just like it right now. And we're letting the way the culture goes left and right against each other impact our church. I think the way we bridge that is by having genuine conversations with people. Our family, I don't know what anyone else's Thanksgiving table looks like, but I know what ours looks like. And we have people around our Thanksgiving table who think very differently about this issue and about a whole host of issues. And we love one another and we care for one another. And I believe we deserve a denomination that is as graceful around differences as our own families are. I also know every local church that I've been in, every United Methodist Church has people on very different places on this issue. But you know what we do with people in our church that we disagree with? We sing in the choir together, we serve at the food pantry together, we worship the Lord together. And when it comes time to bake that funeral casserole, we don't say, well, that person's too liberal for me, I'm not baking their family a casserole. We deserve a denomination that is as gracious with differences as our own churches are, And I think the one church plan allows for that grace. And I think that the way it allows us to talk to one another without the threat of trial from one worldview over the other. It brings us down to equal footing and says we're all valued and we're all children of God. That's a great place to start a conversation.
Okay. Chris?
Well, Ephesians 4 gives us the model. It says, speaking the truth in love. I don't think we honor one another by not being frank and honest with one another. And I don't think we honor one another by being less than loving to one another. And I think I try to put myself in the shoes of my LGBTQ brothers and sisters as this conversation is going on. To me, the conversation is not so much about that spectrum as about the nature of marriage. And to me, that comes down to Jesus' definition in Matthew 19 and in Mark 10. That's given to us. I get a little discouraged when I hear other people talking about what satisfies my conscience when it doesn's I feel like the child is allergic to peanut butter and someone shoving a peanut butter sandwich in my face and you'll be fine. There's some they're deeply held convictions, and I think we need to honor those differences and not wallpaper over them or just pretend like they don't exist. Or, oh, you'll be fine. Your bishop won't agree with you, but you'll be fine. You'll be protected. We're in a low trust environment. And so we need to realize we've had many years of, well, just trust me, we'll all play by the rules. This isn't about just arguing over what's in the book. It's if what we have in our book of discipline is going to be followed or not. And it hasn't been. And so it's our mechanisms for unity that are our mechanisms for decision making. It's not just our decisions that have been questioned, it's our mechanisms. So it's time for us to really be honest with one another, for each of us to name where we're at, and then to, from that point, decide if we can be a church together.
Okay. Rob?
Well, a big part of it is telling the truth, and the other part is hearing the other person. And that's been, again, a frustration on the point of traditionalist. So we have tried to, as often and as clearly as possible, say it's very different than sitting at a Thanksgiving table. If we are changing our sexual ethics to bless something that we believe is contrary to God's will, that we believe is contrary to the scriptures, and that does damage to people, if that becomes the position of the United Methodist Church, we can't be complicit with that. We'll have to leave because we can't give our name to it, we can't give our money to it, we can't give our efforts to it. You would make us complicit with something that we believe promotes sin. We can't do it. North Georgia, their annual conference, took a poll. 25% of the delegates of the North Georgia annual conference said they would leave the United Methodist Church if the one church plan passed. The WCA, admittedly conservative group, just reported on a survey. Over 2,600 people responded. 89% of them said they would leave the denomination if this passed. The good news, which I'm president of, we surveyed 130 leading evangelical pastors. 90% said they would leave if the one church plan passed. I can promise you that if it does, the 4 largest churches in my annual conference will all leave. I've spoken with their pastors. They're all in the top 20 largest United Methodist churches in the country. And then probably a couple hundred others would leave from just my annual conference. So what I ask is to be respectful enough to hear this and to take us seriously and believe that what we're telling you is true. We cannot become complicit with something that we think does damage to people. If people believe the one church plan is worth passing, given that fallout, that's a decision they can make, but they need to know that will be what will happen.
Okay. Althea?
Talking with each other in a spirit of Christian love sounds like a question of very polite conversation, which is what I think we have had here today. I'm concerned that legislative processes are seen to be something other than Christian love, other than the articulation of Christian love. You know, it's a truism that we hold that Cornel West said, justice is what love looks like in the public square. When we have finished having a nice go around where we have been thoughtful and considerate, we are in a panel with 3 Euro-American cisgendered males and 1 immigrant, gay, black female. When we leave this polite conversation, our experience of reality is very different. And that experience of reality is shaped by our attitudes, by the beliefs we hold dear, and ultimately by the ways in which we vote. If our polite conversation does not allow us to see beyond our treasured principles, even when they are theological, and to explore together what it means to say that love transcends all, and that that love has to mean something for how we vote, then loving conversations is never going to be enough, because someone is going to leave those conversations and go into a world of jeopardy and treachery because of the persons that we have had conversations with. If our conversations can't change the fabric of our world, then we have a question around what it is that we're conversing about.
Okay. All right, Mark, would you like to ask one of your fellow panelists a question?
Absolutely. So one of the things that, and Chris, you mentioned this, but Rob, we've talked about it as well. The definition of marriage, Jesus' red letters in Matthew 19 are lifted up all the time for one man and one woman. We know that John Wesley does not view marriage as a sacrament. It's very clear that it's not a sacrament. We only have 2, baptism and communion. But when the same red letters of Jesus call anyone who remarries for reasons other than infidelity an adulterer, and we have bishops who are divorced, we have pastors who are divorced, and we have adulterous marriages by Jesus' definition happening every weekend in our churches, and the same people who are participating in that sexual ethic, that definition of marriage change that happened a generation ago, are willing to overlook it and still say we have to impose the other part of that verse, Matthew 19, on gay and lesbian people, but it doesn't apply to us. So I think there's a strong sense of hypocrisy that's felt when people lift up Matthew 19, half of it, but our church a generation ago has accepted ordination and marriage of people who Jesus calls adulterers. So can you help with that?
Well, it's a difficult issue. I think what we find is that, and I certainly value the words of Jesus above all others, but we have a canon that defines our faith for us. And so the difference, and let me just state that I think we've maybe all agreed that we are too light when it comes to handling divorce. That the church needs to do a better job of helping people become reconciled. But we have an entire canon, and what we find is that there are other places where there are exceptions given. For example, Paul tells the Corinthians that if you are married and a non-believing spouse leaves, you're no longer bound. Jesus said Moses gave you a way of handling divorce, not because it's God's will, but because of your hardness of heart. There is more nuance to the question of divorce and remarriage, and I'm not trying to make a defense of divorce. What we don't do with divorce is say, you know, divorce is my lifestyle, and I feel good about getting divorced over and over again because I can or because that's who I am. We have premarital courses to prevent it. We have counseling when people are thinking about it. We have courses afterwards so that people can be healed and so they can not repeat that issue, or if it's a mistake, that mistake. So the church handles it in a pastoral way, in a proper pastoral way. What we don't find in the scriptures is any nuance whatsoever regarding same-sex sexual relations. There is a consistent witness, no exceptions, and so I understand, and I think it's something good for those of us who are traditionalists to look with and wrestle with what you've pointed out. But I think it's a very different issue than how the Bible approaches same-sex relationships.
Okay.
Althea, would you like to ask one of the other panelists a question?
Yes, and I think, I'm sorry, Rob, I'm going to pitch it to you.
That's okay.
And Chris, it's not that I'm not finding something interesting in your plan. I do, but we don't have time for me to ask that question. So the question to Rob is this. My colleague, Dr. Tracy West, in a presentation, created a picture of our present society where in the U.S. we're moving towards an increasingly punitive and criminalizing stance where LGBTQI persons are concerned. And we are also seeing an increase in violence against such persons. I'd like you to connect that to, when was it, 1976? When the punitive and discriminatory words were placed inside the Book of Discipline. Minority voices were not incredibly strong inside the church. There was not a volume of sound to say, this is discrimination, it should not go in. And so we ended up in a situation where we have this problem today that we're discussing. What do you think will happen to the witness of the United Methodist Church? And I'm channeling Dr. West here. What will happen to the witness of the United Methodist Church when we decide, should we decide to go with a traditional plan? What permissions will it be giving to our larger society about ways of viewing and treating and respecting persons who are minorities and tremendously different in our society? And what would be our moral responsibility and culpability in that?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I think all of us, we're all committed Christians. And so consequently, we know that the ethic that we live by is the ethic of love. And any time that anyone is mistreated for any reason, especially because of their identity in some form, it's deplorable. It's something that we all rise up against and speak out against. So I think we're very similar in that regard. And again, whenever I speak on this, the vast majority of my opening comments is that this is never a subject to be taken lightly. It's never a subject for people to even joke about, that's beneath us, and that if we cannot love people and accept people, then we have a bigger problem than the person that we can't accept. So I think it's very important that we have not just a balanced message, but those of us who have a traditional position, that we lead, and we're very, very strong, that we should be the biggest champions of protecting people's rights and their dignity. And if we're not doing that, then we are failing as representatives of Christ. I think it's possible to affirm people completely, welcome people, protect their rights, and at the same time to say that some sexual practices fall outside of what Scripture has revealed to be God's will. I believe we can do that, and I believe we should do that.
Okay, I'm going to turn to you for a question since you've...
Okay. Well, probably not surprisingly, Mark, okay? I know you don't like the word compromise, but what I think that sometimes the one church plan is portrayed as it ends the fighting. Okay, everybody gets to do or be what they want to be. I see that differently, and I want your input. So right now we go and we do fight, unfortunately, every 4 years in a city far away. And it's not a pleasant experience for anybody. The way that I see the one church plan is that, for example, my annual conference, we usually vote about 2-to-1 for a traditional position. So once this plan is passed, it doesn't draw lines. Compromise, I think, says, okay, I didn't get everything I wanted, you didn't get everything you wanted, but we'll draw the lines here and we'll stop fighting. But this doesn't stop the fighting, because my annual conference and many annual conferences that vote for a traditional plan will have this brought every year to our annual conferences. And it won't be in a city far away with people we don't know. It'll be with our colleagues in ministry. And then it will also bring it into our local churches. You say that you won't have to vote, but most of our churches, at least in areas like I live in, you're going to have parents, or you're going to have gay couples. They'll want to get married, or they want their children to get married, and they will bring that into our church. And now we will have to vote on that. And it won't be in St. Louis. It will be people in our pews that know each other and love each other, maybe raise their children together. And one couple had their daughter married in the church, and now we're voting on whether or not we can marry someone else's daughter in the church. And I cannot imagine the wedge and the hurt and the pain that's going to bring right into our pews. I hate it at General Conference. I cannot imagine it in our local churches. I'm almost done. This localizes the pain and the fighting rather than relieving us from it.
Well, I appreciate your statement. I do believe that your statement's based entirely on your perspective right now, because you're in a conservative church and in a denomination that has a conservative position. There are people that feel exactly the same way right now in their local churches, who have to tell families why we can't marry them and why we can't ordain their children who've been called to ministry. So there are conferences right now, local churches right now, that are being torn apart and saying, well, if I can't get married in the United Methodist Church, I'm going to go to another church that welcomes me. So right now, the conservative churches have been spared the conversation that progressive churches have been undergoing for the last 40 years, trying to explain to progressive people why our church doesn't fully value them and their children. That's a very difficult conversation, and you're right, it's difficult. And we are losing people who need to be in a church where they're fully affirmed. And so the statement that this will bring it down to the local church, you've just had the luxury of not having to talk about it the way the progressive churches have in progressive conferences.
You don't see a difference between voting and having a conversation?
I do, because I think that the pain is the same. And I do believe, I believe in healthy churches and healthy pastors. We're called by God to have difficult conversations with people. We do it all the time. We do it in hospitals. We do it around hospice care. We do it for life and death issues. We talk to people whose children are going through drug and alcohol issues. I mean, we talk about difficult issues as a church all the time and how to be in ministry. I trust our churches. I believe people are able to have these conversations, and we can model that and we can lead that. But these difficult conversations are already going on. And what we want to do with the one church plan is to remove one group controlling the other and forcing the position on them, but to allowing people to organically do that for their mission field, which I believe, and I think supporters of the one church plan believe, is a healthier form of conversation than having to explain why we're being punished by a group that's far, far away.
Okay, Chris?
I'll also ask a question to Mark. Some of us that are on the traditionalist side, I'm a traditionalist. I support the Connectional Conference Plan and the traditional plan. There are progressives that support the Connectional Conference Plan. But some of us on the traditionalist side look at the one church plan, and we see features like laity. The laity at annual conference don't decide whether there should be self-avowed practicing homosexual clergy. We look at the fact that bishops, traditionalist bishops, are nevertheless required to ordain all clergy in good standing. We look at...
Do you mean appoint?
Appoint, thank you for that, in good standing. A lot of us have said over and over again, we couldn't live in, we couldn't live in such a reality, and we seem not to be heard. So do you believe, I guess my question is, do you believe us when we say that the one church plan isn't going to work for a large number of United Methodists?
I do believe you. I do believe you, and I do think that and it's sad to me. I mean, you said you don't like the winners and losers either, right? You don't want people walking away feeling harmed. I don't want people walking away feeling harmed. I do believe there's a fundamental difference in imposing versus allowing. And that's a fundamental ecclesiological difference about what it means to be the church. Should we be punishing people with a different worldview, or should we be allowing folks to make decisions in their own environment? I do disagree. You know, there's a big talking point for the traditional plan is the laity have no say over who becomes a pastor. For the last 200 and some years, lay people sponsor folks at the local church is the only way you can get into the ordination path. There are lay people on the Board of Ordained Ministry, both district and conference, and half the votes at General Conference are lay people. And so to say the lay people have no say, I mean, we've trusted the clergy session to do the review and approval for the last 200 years. I don't know why we don't trust our clergy anymore. But it's not changing how it's being done now. So I disagree with that talking point. But nevertheless, I do think that there is a challenge. I do believe people who say, I can't be in a church where others are practicing differently than me. The Connectional Conference Plan actually has that same problem, because it has the same, we're still under the same name brand, but doing different practices. And so my view is, if you're willing to share the same name brand, conservative and progressive churches, the one church plan does that organically without all the reorganization. That if we're going to serve the same denomination with the same name, and we're going to be loosely affiliated, there's not a huge difference in my mind from the one church plan and the Connectional Conference plan, other than yours might address the trust issue more, because I think you're accurate in saying we're in a low trust environment, that people don't trust bishops and they don't trust their district superintendents. But other than that, I think it's a similar plan.
I'd just like to maybe add that the Connectional Conference plan does have 3 different brands. So you use the United Methodist name, but you also have some distinctiveness.
That's fair. Thank you.
And if I might, I know I'm sort of on a different point, but the conference plan, the CCP, performs, you're presenting it as if there will never be LGBTQI persons in those conferences. What will happen when they turn up, when we turn up in those conferences? Will it be another restructuring? Shouldn't we at this point be trying to find a way to truly live together, rather than putting ourselves in the position where we enter into a cycle of restructuring because LGBTQ persons turn up in our midst? That is a real problem. It's as if we disappear because we have restructured, and we don't.
Well, I'd just like to speak to that. I'm a pastor, and like many pastors, I'm honored and blessed to pastor folks that are same-sex attracted. There's a lot of people that, our church believes in confessing our sins to one another. So I have people come in my office, and I have folks that are openly gay in my church, and I have folks that are same-sex attracted, and they're trying to live by the understanding of Scripture that our Book of Discipline says now. None of these plans is designed to eliminate LGBTQ folks from a church. That's not a goal of any of them. That's not something that we're seeking. I think the folks that do get left out are the folks who have actually listened to our church's teaching, and they say, I'm same-sex attracted, but I agree this is what the Scriptures say, and they're not trying to draw attention to themselves, but they've actually formed their life around the current teachings of our church. I think sometimes they get left out of this discussion. But none of these plans will end disagreement. None of these plans will say, I love what some of my progressive brothers and sisters on the commission say, is that everyone in all these conversations, we all want to minister to LGBTQ folks. The difference is how we want to do that and how we feel is faithful to Scripture. Okay. So I don't expect that to change.
We're going to move to the closing statement portion, and Mark, I'm going to start with you, a 1-minute closing statement from each of the panelists.
All right. Well, I want to thank the United Methodist News Service, and I want to thank my brothers and sister in Christ for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's a benefit to the church to be able to talk about the plans in this kind of format. So thank you for providing the format and the opportunity. I do think the One Church plan, it's not a panacea, but it takes the conflict in our church, and instead of ramping up the punishment, it inserts grace. Instead of dividing us up, it inserts grace. And it inserts grace to say, we are of different minds, we have different mission fields, and we need to be effective in reaching those mission fields. And the best way we can be effective is to allow conservative churches to be conservative, progressive churches to be progressive, and the same with the pastors, the annual conferences, and the bishops. I think the One Church plan is a great grace moment that has been given to us by the bishops. And I would say if you are interested in more information, I'm the executive director of Mainstream UMC, and our website is mainstreamumc.com, and I would invite you to go and you can find more resources about the One Church plan.
Okay. Rob?
If I can build on what Mark said, I do hope that we can be one church. I have a problem with contextualization being different messages for different audiences or different parts of the country. We're not selling soda pop. We're not trying to find out what sells in different sections of the country or to different audiences. We're called to speak the truth in love. And so the question is, has God spoken about sexuality? Has he spoken clearly enough that we know what it is? And is it important enough that we as United Methodists have a position rather than thinking that anybody can hold any and preach any view? And then that'll be okay because that's what people want to hear and will attract people. That's not what contextualization means. Contextualization is, how can I speak the truth that God has revealed in his word in such a way that that person can hear it as the gracious invitation for a life of transformation and a life of relationship with God.
Okay. Chris, I'm going to.
I too would like to thank United Methodist Communications for hosting this forum, and I guess I'd like to speak to delegates. I think the Connectional Conference Plan is not the first choice of a lot of folks, but I think as we're kind of grading the legislation, let's all vote for our favorite plan, and let's vote for the plan that provides a structural place for everyone. And so if we could be open to the Connectional Conference Plan, I think in that 3 or 4 days that we're going to be together praying and talking about this, that more and more people may come to realize this is the best path forward, given our current players, given the situation we find ourselves in. And so I hope we all just stay open to the Holy Spirit and looking at the full range of options before us.
Okay. Althea?
Thankful. I'm thankful too for this opportunity, for this conversation that we have had. I would like to put the simple plan right there as actually the best plan, because it allows for persons to live according to their beliefs, but in one body. It seeks to move the church to that place where we abhor any form of discrimination, and that is our plain message. It calls for LGBTQI persons to have more than simple welcome in the churches, but within the church, should we hear God's call to a different kind of service, a full-time service, that we have room for that growth to happen. Thank you for this. We don't fully eliminate discrimination. None of the plans is perfect, but I do think the simple plan allows us to be the fullest church that we can be. Thank you.
Okay. I really appreciate you all being here. Thank you for presenting your position so eloquently. We encourage our viewers to share this important discussion widely. As I mentioned before, UM News is committed to providing fair, balanced coverage of the issues before the church. Turn to us to coverage before, after, and during the special session, which is February 23rd through 26th. The best way to make sure you see all of the coverage is to sign up for the UM News Daily Digest. In addition to English, you'll find coverage in French, Korean, Spanish, and Portuguese. Click subscribe on our site, umnews.org. It's easy and there's no cost to you. Finally, I want to remind you that the Commission on General Conference will live stream gavel-to-gavel coverage of the special session in both English and French, February 23rd through the 26th. The coverage can be found on umnews.org. Thanks again to our guests and to our viewers as we near this historic event within the United Methodist Church.
Thank you.
Thank you.